Hello to all listeners on this journey for us of African descent to improve our quality of life and standard of living. I am Sophia Worrell, and we are on day 3 of this quest for answers and solutions to the problem that we face. We of African descent are always pounded over the head by black agitators, protesters, and activists telling us that we should know our history. These persons are quick to cry white supremacy and blame slave owners for taking African men and women from their homeland and making them work for nothing. But if you would recall yesterday, I asked you that you would consider two parts, as in the case of something having two sides, in which one cannot exist without the other. Allow me to form a framework. We have established that we were created by God and that the first man and woman dropped the ball. But we did not just show up. The Bible tells us how it all started. But we do not have to look at historical events only. We need to tie both the Bible and history together. First of all, life did not begin in Africa. Life began in the Garden of Eden, where there was the eventual fall of man. The biblical accounts tells us how we came into being. Then ancient history and later modern history tells us how we got to this point. We need both the biblical accounts and historical records to give us a point of reference so that we can establish the fact that we all came from the same human race and each one of us matter in the grand scheme of things. Feel free to use a notepad to take notes, because I will be presenting a lot of information from this point on and will be asking you to participate in several exercises and activities as I stated in the introduction to this course. If you wondered what the building blocks of life was, I will help you to understand over the next sections. Just keep in mind two main parts. Everything is connected, and the black problem is not one of slavery. It is actually rooted in detachment. Let me clarify this statement. Everything in life is well organized. The organization started with God, and since we are His seed, this allows us how to build and shape our lives and everything around us. Just as each day God allows the sun to rise for us to get up and work, and signals time to rest by the moon at night, so we organize our lives around this 24-hour system. So with that in mind, we can look at our history as African descendants and use that information to restructure our lives by examining what happened, not from one side, but from both sides of the equation, because one could not have happened without the permission of the other. So we're going to look at the history of slavery in America and the Caribbean for that matter, and we're going to look at it through the lens of the who, the why, and the what. So let's look at the slave trade. History tells us that European voyagers of discovery started a new era of slavery. But slavery had existed since antiquity and flourished in many parts of the world. Greek, European, Jews, Indians, and people from third Turkey were some of the nations that were enslaved. However, their slaves were captured in war or piracy. African slaves were sold by other African people. Many parents sold their children out of poverty into servitude. In the Americas, slavery expanded because Africans, it was argued, were more suitable than Native Americans who were being worked to death. Because of the physical labor, toil, torture, and threat of death, African slaves would run away but never united for an outright revolt. But this did not calm the fears of the slaveholders. This is because the slaveholders would have themselves banded together if they were in the position of the slaves who outnumbered their owners. Despite this, the owners never let their guard down. They always felt that a revolt was beneath the surface of every slave-based society. This forced them to keep one step ahead of the slaves. In fact, in 1720, the governor of Virginia reminded the colonial legislature of the need for increasing vigilance and stated that we are not to depend on either their stupidity or those Babel languages among them. Freedom wears a cap which cannot without a tongue call together all those who long to shed the fetters of slavery. Even though the traffic in slaves disturbed some Europeans, other Europeans who were slaveholders began to justify their actions by demeaning the mental and spiritual qualities of the enslaved Africans. White Europeans and colonists sometimes describe black slaves as animalistic, akin to apes. A leading New England Puritan asserted about the slaves. Indeed, their stupidity is a discouragement. It may seem unto as little purpose to teach as to wash an Ethiopian. In short, the European slave owners did not have any respect for these people who allowed themselves to be held and work like animals in the fields and in the homes of the slave owners without ever fighting back as a group. Now, this history seems one-sided and seems to justify what white Europeans did. But I just want to pull out a couple of points for consideration. Remember, there cannot be one side without the other. There were two who's in this equation. The first who were European white men who had taken land and wanted it worked. The second who were enslaved African men who not only sold each other but allowed themselves to be worked like animals without protesting. We must hold both of them accountable, and especially those men who did nothing as a group against to stop what they consider was an injustice. We must get an answer to why those African men did not fight off those white men who kept coming to their land. We must get an explanation for why, when they arrive at the plantation, African men just fended for themselves and not unite as a group of oppressed people. And finally, we blame the white man for doing this evil thing to other men. But why don't we hold ourselves accountable for centuries of slavery when we allowed it to happen and did nothing to stop it? The simple answer is that no one can take another without his consent. This is the sad truth of both sides of the coin. To go deeper, what does this say about the mind of the African man? What does this say about the ability of our forefathers who never seemed to be able to come up with a plan or strategy to defend themselves and their fellow men? Where did this kind of sluggishness come from? There's a reason why those men did nothing and why they allowed what we call Rome to continue for 2 centuries until other groups of European white people appealed to the government for them as slaves to be rescued. It was not the slaves themselves, but others who brought about the end to slavery. The refusal for people of African descent to work on their own behalf has been the lot and legacy that has caused this black problem of detachment. While doing this research, I also researched other oppressed groups. What was apparent is that those other groups fought for their own freedom and rebuilt their own lives. They did not waste time blaming the men who did merciless acts against them and are now dead and gone. Although they acknowledged the injustices, they did not dwell on them but worked with each other to overcome and move on with their lives, unlike us of African descent who have not done anything significant to improve our circumstances. These other groups of people put their family units back together and went on to build wealth. On the contrary, we fall prey to every trap that is laid before us. We still have that tendency to fend for ourselves. We have not yet learned that true freedom is not in singleness, but in unity. This course is to remind us that we live in the best time in history where there is nothing and no one in our way. There are many of us of African descent that are now being stereotyped with those who act barbaric and unintelligent. Their thug-like behavior is not what we want represented in our culture anymore. This is not God's way. This is not the American way. It is time to build a culture that is peaceful, loving, and kind. Thank you.